Hey, I have another story for you today um, about a famous person in history. And the story is called Little Sure Shot. Do you mean to tell me this is the first time you've ever been in a shooting gallery? The manager shouted. Annie had never seen anyone so surprised. She looked directly up at the man in charge of the gallery. Yes, sir, she replied softly. This is the first time I've ever been in Cincinnati, too. I'm visiting my sister. I didn't know that people shot rifles just for fun until today. The manager paced the floor excitedly. Do you realize what you've done? He thundered. Did I do something wrong? Annie asked meekly. Wrong? Wrong? He bellowed. Then, turning abruptly to the other shooters, he moaned. She's just hit the bullseye 6 times in a row, and she asks if she's done something wrong. He slapped his forehead twice with his hand. Isn't that what you told me to do? Annie asked, and nervously turned to look at her sister. Her sister hurried over, grabbed Annie, and hugged her tight. What did I do wrong? Annie asked again. You didn't do anything wrong, miss. It's just that not very many people can shoot that well. You're a great shot. People began crowding around Annie in wonder. Where did you learn to shoot like that? The excited manager asked. By shooting birds at home, Annie explained, still confused by all the attention she was getting. I had to hunt food for my family. You're one of the best shots I've seen in all the years that I've had this gallery. And you're only a kid, too. The manager almost danced with excitement. Just beginner's luck, maybe, someone shouted. Let her try to hit the ducks. Annie turned to the targets. She saw a row of metal ducks. She wondered why anyone thought it would be hard to hit them. Yeah, a woman called out. Let's see her try to hit the ducks. The manager handed her another gun. Try to hit them, he said, while he pulled a lever to start the ducks moving from side to side. Confidently, Annie balanced the rifle in her hands, swung it to her shoulder, sighted along the barrel, and fired 6 shots quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ducks fell, one after another. For a second, nobody said anything. Then, suddenly, everyone began to cheer. What about having a shooting match between Annie and Frank Butler? Someone asked. Annie didn't know who Frank Butler was, but her sister told her that he was the best shot in Cincinnati. He makes his living entertaining people with his shooting, she told Annie. Wouldn't it be fun to make a living by shooting for people's entertainment? Asked Annie aloud. Happily, Annie accepted the suggestion to have a match with Butler. The following day, when the manager of the shooting gallery came to tell her the match was scheduled for Friday night, Annie's eyes glistened. It was still a mystery to her, though, why everyone was so excited. Shooting metal ducks was easy. On Friday evening, her sister brought Annie to the place where the match was to be held. There was a crowd waiting when they arrived. News of the match had spread all over town. Annie looked around. There seemed to be hundreds of people milling about. One lone man was standing nearby. He looked older than Annie, maybe 8 or 10 years older, and he had on a fancy jacket that made her ashamed of her homemade dress. The manager of the shooting gallery greeted her pleasantly and then turned to the man with the fancy jacket. Mr. Butler, here's the young lady who challenges you. Frank Butler looked at Annie's face and at her 2 braids of chestnut hair falling on her shoulders. Then he turned to the manager. "What's the matter with you, Jake? Professionals don't take advantage of youngsters." You haven't seen her shoot, Frank. She's good." "But she's only a kid." "She's older than she looks, Frank." "I'm sorry, Jake. I won't do it." Annie felt her face turning red. Her knees began to wobble. "He thinks I'm just a child," she thought. She wished she had never left her home to come to Cincinnati. At home, she could take her rifle and tramp by herself through the woods and cornfields, hunting quail, grouse, and pigeons. That was what she liked to do best. Frank Butler didn't think she could shoot. That was it. He didn't think she knew how. Well, she'd show him. Looking straight at him, she asked, "Are you afraid, Mr. Butler?" Frank Butler's face flushed. "It just isn't fair to you, Annie," he said. "I'm willing," she answered. Butler shrugged his shoulders. "All right, but don't expect me to make it easy for you." He then turned to the manager. "Okay, Jake, let's start." The manager explained to Annie how the match would work. "You will shoot at clay targets that move through the air," he said. "You will take turns, each shooting at one target at a time. Whoever turn it is to shoot will get ready and call out, 'Pull!' A target will be thrown into the air, and you will fire at it." Annie nodded. The manager went on, "If you hit the target, the referee will shout, 'Dead!' If you miss, the referee will shout, 'Miss!' Whoever has hit the most targets after 25 shots will be the winner. Do you understand, Annie?" "Yes, sir." They took their places at the line. Frank Butler was to shoot first. "Pull!" he called, and a target sailed into the air. He swung the gun to his shoulder and fired. "Dead!" called the referee as the target fell. Now it was Annie's turn. She could not keep her hands from shaking and didn't see how she could hold the gun steady. The stillness of the people all around her made her feel embarrassed. She knew that everyone was looking at her. She wanted to go back home, but she knew she couldn't do that. In one fleeting second, she put everything else out of her mind and imagined she was in the woods back home shooting at quail. "Pull!" she called. A target flew up. Annie fired quickly. "Dead!" called the referee. Round after round, Frank Butler and Annie kept taking turns and never missing. As the match went on, the look on Frank Butler's face changed from amazement to surprise to respect for Annie's shooting. Finally, it was the last round. Butler stepped up to the line. "Pull!" he said. The target flew through the air. Frank Butler fired. The target swept past. "Miss!" shouted the referee. The crowd buzzed excitedly. Now it was Annie's final shot. The crowd became silent again. "Pull!" she called and pressed the trigger. "Dead!" called the referee. Annie had won the match. She had beaten Frank Butler. The crowd gathered around her, cheering and shouting her name. Annie looked at Frank Butler, who was standing alone. She wondered if he was angry at her. What right did she have to beat the best shot in Cincinnati? She started to walk toward Butler. He came over to meet her. "Annie, that was fine shooting." "Thank you, Mr. Butler." Frank Butler looked at Annie for a moment. Then a wide grin spread across his face. "You know, you're a good enough shot to go on the stage," he said. "Oh, Mr. Butler, That would be wonderful, she replied. Annie in this story was Phoebe Ann Oakley Mosey, who later became known as Annie Oakley. Annie and Frank Butler fell in love and they got married. And they became partners on the stage too. Together they traveled to many parts of the world and amazed people with their shooting. Annie was such a remarkable shooter that she could shoot things sticking out of people's mouths without hurting them, or hit a playing card from a long way off with only the thin edge of the card facing her. How could she do that? Because of her size and her shooting, Annie was nicknamed Little Sure Shot. And that's the end.